Well, some others may join us as we continue, but let's go ahead and start with this opening prayer. Let us pray. Lord of all power and might, the author and giver of all good things, graft in our hearts the love of your name. Increase in us true religion. Nourish us with all goodness, and bring forth in us the fruit of good works. Through Jesus Christ our Lord, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever.
Amen.
Amen. So two things that I think sort of connect this collect with where we're going with the scriptures is this sense of graft into our hearts. And Jesus is going to talk about hearts in some ways, what comes out of the body. And then this a little bit of an interesting term, true religion. Increase in us true religion. And you'll see in all three lessons, I think the people in many ways and earnestly and well-intentioned are striving for true religion, true observance. And, sometimes religious things become very doctrinal. Sometimes religious things become rather dogmatic. Sometimes people say, I'm spiritual, but not religious, because they've been turned off by what they consider religiosity. So it's an interesting thing to think, really, what is this true religion that we're asking the Lord to increase in us? And maybe since God knows exactly what it is, we just ask for the increase, and then it whatever it is comes. But hope to find it nourishing. But I am curious, and this is somewhat from the preacher's perspective, but also just from these lessons, what true religion is. So
the Taliban think they have true religion.
That's right, they do. And so do the Orthodox Jews, and so do the Roman Catholics, and so do, you go on down the line. A lot of differing opinions about what true religion is. Moses has his opinion of true religion too, so we're gonna talk about that. In terms of chronology in the Old Testament, we're going backwards from last week. Last week we read from Joshua, and that's probably 40 years after what we're reading today, somewhere in that neighborhood. Deuteronomy is almost a recap of what's happened with the Exodus, along with a little bit of action. And a lot of what Moses says in Deuteronomy is looking back and reminding them of what has come before, reminding them about the Ten Commandments, reminding them about what God has done. But it's also this narrative, this description, this narration of what's happening, that by this point in Deuteronomy, Joshua has been identified as the person who will lead them into the land of milk and honey. Moses has been told that he will not be the one to do it. And there have been some problems in the rank and file of the Israelites, and the 40 years of wandering and having to backtrack and coming back up. If you read chapters 1 through 3 of Deuteronomy, you get some of that. If you feel like going a little bit deeper, you can do that. But then Moses gets to this place where he's speaking for God and has this to say about moving forward, not so much about going back, but about moving forward and what is going to set them apart as wise and discerning people, or what you might even say as people practicing true religion. Jeff, would you read this for us?
Yes, be happy to. Moses said, "So now, Israel, give heed to the statutes and the ordinances that I am teaching you to observe, so that you may live to enter and occupy the land that the Lord, the God of your ancestors, is giving you. You must neither add anything to what I command you, nor take anything away from it, but keep the commandments of the Lord your God, with which I am charging you. You must observe them diligently, for this will show your wisdom and discernment to the people, who, when they hear all these statutes, will say, surely this great nation is a wise and discerning people. For what other great nation has a God so near to it as the Lord our God is whenever we call to him? And what other great nation has statutes and ordinances as just as this entire law that I am setting before you today? But take care and watch yourselves closely, so as neither to forget the things that your eyes have seen, nor to let them slip from your mind all the days of your life. Make them known to your children and your children's children. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
So let's just start here with observations and questions. What do you all observe in this?
It's all about following the rules.
Following the rules. That is certainly part of it.
What struck me was that sentence, you must neither add anything to what I command nor take anything away from it. And I think that's hard to do sometimes. We, talking about true religion or commandments and things like that, we want to kind of tweak them a little bit and make them suit us. And so that part is what struck me.
That's true. And part of the conflict, part of the rub in the gospel lesson is between Jesus and the scribes and the Pharisees. And Jesus is basically saying, you all have, there's some human traditions of the elders you've added to the law, and therefore you aren't following the spirit of the law. So the Pharisees and scribes are getting on Jesus for not having true religion, and Jesus's retort to them is, no, here is this other thing, which is essentially a kind of moral code, which seems similar to what Moses is giving. There's a moral code. There's something about being wise and discerning. And this is not just the 10 Commandments, which have already been given. This is a bigger law that gets explained in all of Deuteronomy, from festivals to be observed and how to treat slaves and all these other kind of things besides the 10 Commandments. So it is, and a lot of people would say it's really this that the scribes and Pharisees were adhering to and getting on to people because they didn't follow it.
I like the part about make this known to your children and your children's children.
Yes, this is the legacy for the people, which is really what the scriptures do, is to make it known to us.
I think we see in the church today, in the churches today, where if there's things in particularly in the Old Testament that they don't like, they just ignore them, ignore the teaching of specific teachings. And that's been a complaint of mine for a long time, that if you're going to embrace it as the truth, you have to embrace all of it. And that a lot of people are not willing to do.
And I'm one of them. I'll tell you that there are some places of the Old Testament that say you should stone your children when they disobey you and put them to death. And that's not one that I'm going to obey. And I don't think you're not going to hear me. You're not going to hear me preaching that. And so there are some troublesome parts of the Old Testament. And one wonders, like Jesus was saying, if those have become the traditions of the elders, really, rather than the law. And he is trying to clarify some things in his teaching. So I don't mean to make light of what you're saying. I do agree, Rich, that there are some things that people just seem to push aside because it's not convenient or it doesn't make sense.
I don't know if you realize it.
But there are some other ones that are troublesome that I'm happy that we don't practice. Again, I think when Jesus says summary of the law, it hangs on the law of the prophets: love God with heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. A lot of that whittles it down to what "quote unquote" true religion is.
Well,
and that's why I'm so thankful for the New Testament and the gospel, because it is the good news. And the Old Testament is rough in places for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
being stoned today has a whole different meaning.
It does. It's the children who are getting stoned, and they're saying, "I'm fine getting stoned." It's just, and some adults too, I might add. Collins, I saw your hand up. Uh-oh, Collins may be on an internet delay. Maisie, I see your hand up. You got to unmute yourself.
We don't see Maisie.
There you go.
Okay, I had two things to say. One real quick. St. Paul added some things in the New Testament that we don't, we sort of see as cultural for the, that were part of the times. Anyway, the thing I like in this Deuteronomy is surely this great nation is a wise and discerning people, for what other great nation has a God so near to it as the Lord our God is whenever we call on him. That's pretty powerful that we have a God that's so near.
Right. Thank you.
I'd like to follow up on that. The Deuteronomy introduces one of three, if you will, basic tenets for salvation. To summarize it, it's in keeping the commandments. Many Jewish people felt that they would be saved. You migrate over to what you were talking about, Paul introducing salvation comes through faith in Jesus, his dying and being raised again. And the third doctrine of salvation somewhat is introduced in James's epistle and next week's reading in James about you're saved by works. And those three are, how do I say, those are common denominators oftentimes for distinguishing between your religion and true religion, or my religion and their religion. So it's interesting that we have them, if at least two of the three mentioned in these readings today.
Again, the question, what is true religion, and how do we, if we're trying to get there, which of those common denominators, as Collins was describing, and which do we gravitate towards? Bill, I saw your hand up. Yeah.
Well, this is kind of an editorial comment, which is a humbling comment. I think we're taught in true religion that it's what you hear that's what's most important. So the last sentence would probably add, but take care and watch yourselves closely. So it's neither to forget the things your eyes have seen nor what your ears have heard, to let them slip from your mind all the days of your life. But this is I really still a little bit want to hear a little bit more from you about what true religion really is. You've already helped me out, but is there anything else to say? Is what
Right. There's a lot to say, and I wish it were a simple 5-word, 10-word definition of what true religion is, but I would venture to say it's not that simple. I will say one other thing in this passage that's of interest to me is this phrase, watch yourselves closely. Sometimes we get in the habit of watching other people rather than watching ourselves. And I think to some degree, that is part of what I would describe as true religion, in the sense that self-analysis, looking at yourself. For example, the prodigal son maybe had not been watching himself too closely. He gets into that pinch, and then he sees himself and is honest about that. And there are others who, had they been watching themselves, maybe David is a good example of that, or even Solomon, maybe Judas. There are long lists of people here that were much more interested in watching others. At other times, Jesus calls the scribes and the Pharisees whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the inside, but the second you open them up, there's rot and decay and stink and things like that. So his accusation with the scribes and the Pharisees, not in today's passage, but other ones, is that they really have not been watching themselves closely.
Rob,
Yes.
I think, just my thought, as Christians, I think that the true religion boils down to the summary of the law, and you know, everything else is, to us, is based on that. You love thy neighbor as thyself, love the Lord thy God, with all thy heart and soul and strength.
I think you'd, if this were a test, you'd probably get an A for that answer. Anyone else want to comment on this Deuteronomy piece? Maisie?
I just think that to add to that, and I know that is the heart of it, but I think that it's so easy to get off track if the scripture that tells us, that Paul tells us, that we are justified by faith, not by works, because so much human religion, humanism, is based on what we do, and we think we're justified by doing, you know, even though James does say it's your works, but I just think that first has to come our faith in Jesus, is what truly saves us.
Right. And we're really not too far apart from what Jesus is saying today and what James is saying. Again, these are brothers. And I said they listened to the same mama and they got the same type of thing. But Paul is saying faith without works is dead.
Mm-hmm.
And the same type of thing as Jesus is saying, that that's sort of lip service.
I think
And what Jesus is saying is also sort of that Pharisees and scribes have gone to lip service, and their works aren't showing that kind of fruit.
I think that works are the pretty much the direct result of faith.
Right. All right. Well, let's remember this and move on to the Psalm. Rich and Mary, could y'all read this alternating verses, please?
Okay. Thank you. Psalm 15. Lord, who may dwell in your tabernacle? Who may abide upon your holy hill?
Whoever leads a blameless life and does what is right, who speaks the truth from his heart.
There is no guile upon his tongue. He does no evil to his friend. He does not heap contempt upon his neighbor.
In his sight, the wicked is rejected, but he honors those who fear the Lord.
He has sworn to do no wrong, and he does not take back his word.
He does not give his money in hope of gain, nor does he take a bribe against the innocent.
Whoever does these things shall never be overthrown.
Thank you. There's some wonderful parts of this. You can see how in this, this is true religion too, in some ways. The whole of it is following some things, having a moral code. There's some loving your neighbor in here. There's fear of the Lord, a love of the Lord in here. But then also some very specific things. So let me just leave it at that for a moment and see what comments and thoughts you have based on this. Collins?
Yes, it's been said that this is known as the entrance psalm, and that it's a psalm sung by the lay people, if you will, seeking entrance into,
and it's like a kind of a quiz to the priest, if you will. What is it that we need to do to gain entrance into the tent or the church, if you will, and the questions are answered by, if you will, the priest. And so it's a sort of an early relationship between the laity and the ordained.
Good point. And the sense in verse 1 of what their tabernacle is, it could be seen as the temple in Jerusalem. It could be seen as the tent of meeting or other places like that before they were in Jerusalem. Holy Hill certainly makes me think about Jerusalem. And there was, to go into the temple, one needed to be clean. And there are all types of ritual cleansing that goes on in baths and other ways before that. It's why people who were lame or ill or some ways couldn't enter, because that was sometimes seen as being unclean.
What I see here is one verse that asks the question and then the rest of them answer it. But basically, verse 2 has those three requirements: lead a blameless life, do what is right, speak the truth. And then the rest of those verses elaborate on what it means to lead the blameless life, do what is right, and speak the truth. And it's just very, very clearly laid out, I think.
Good point. Very nice.
One of the issues in our modern society is giving and charitable thinking and doing. Line 6, he does not give his money in hope of gain. How do you feel about that, Rob? I mean,
well, that sounds similar to me what Jesus says later on when he's talking about praying. Pray in secret. The idea of praying is not to let everybody else know how good prayer you are, but just to be alone with God. And he says the same thing about money. If you're going to give alms, do not let your right hand know what your left hand is doing. You're not doing it for fame. You're not doing it for pride. You're not doing it to say, oh, look at me. And you're certainly not doing it to say gain influence. Oh, if I give X amount of dollars to the church, that way I'm going to get into heaven, or that way I'm going to be recognized by the establishment, or that way I'm going to be of higher importance to somebody, or that way I may get appointed to such and such. So there are all those type of things that can happen. But the idea of giving money is that there are people in need, and it's more of a selfless act. And even I sometimes I have a knee-jerk reaction when people talk about their giving as if it's almost only for the tax benefit of giving. I'm doing this to get a write-off. And people do, and there is that write-off, and if you're going to do it, claim it. But if your primary motivation is the write-off instead of giving to that organization which needs it, then I think there's some lack of alignment in that giving that's there. So that's just a cautionary note about that kind of thing. I don't know, Bill, what is your thought about all that?
well, I follow what you're saying, and I find it helpful to be reminded that what you said and what Jesus thought and proclaimed is correct, proper way.
And even the widow's mite, the little bit that she gave at the end, she wasn't hoping to gain anything. It was really an act of trust in God in that way.
Yeah, that's my take on giving, is that when we give, it puts us in position to trust God, to take care of our needs. And that we can freely give what we have in abundance, and trust that God will take care.
Right.
I'd like,
Yeah, Collins and then Jeff.
I'd like to focus on one word, abide, A-B-I-D-E. I mistakenly thought abide was related to abode, a place of residency, if you will, where one may live.
Yeah, that threw me a little bit, abiding in the tabernacle. So go ahead.
Right. The definition of abide as a verb is that it's to accept or act in accordance with a rule or decision or recommendation. And an informal definition is to be unable to tolerate someone or something, which is enlightening, if you will, that the psalm starts off with the question of who may abide, if you will, who may act in accordance with, your rule on your holy hill. It's almost, it sounds like a prayer to be reminded of what Moses was talking about in Deuteronomy.
I think it has to do in the line of those definitions, the sense of being in community. To abide with people is to be in sync with them, or to be in sync with God in that kind of way. Jeff, did you have your hand up?
Well, I was just thinking that this is pointing us, it's a good thing we have Jesus in the New Testament, because I would ask, who among us leads a blameless life?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And if that becomes the goal, then, the Pharisaic way of life is the life to choose. And that's what Paul thought. That's why he was a Pharisee. If you've been watching the Chosen series, like we did last night, the Pharisees are in there, and there is a young and zealous sort of upstart Pharisee who's really having a problem with the way things are happening, because he just is happily to place the blame on others. But I think what, as we read in Deuteronomy, he's not taking maybe a close look at himself in those kind of ways. This idea from the heart is going to come up again in some of what Jesus is saying, of things that come from within inside a person. It's not the things from outside a person that defile. It's the things that are already in there, with a slight reference maybe even to what we would call original sin. That's just part of who we are. Maisie?
I just have one little comment on something in line 4, verse 4. In his sight, the wicked is rejected. I take that to mean wickedness, not wicked people. I mean, wicked people, yeah, but they're not to be rejected, but.
Yeah, in his sight, what is wicked is rejected. Something like that might be a paraphrase of that.
If it were the people, it would be the wicked are rejected, wouldn't it? But wicked.
Yes, grammatically, I think you're right on that.
Okay.
The next line, but he honors those who fear the Lord, seems to be the opposite of the wicked. So that does seem to be people versus just evil.
Yeah.
And I think we can get in here and split hairs without
I know. But
thinking about that. I mean, it's just, hate the sin, love the sinner kind of thing is what gets tossed around sometimes.
Yeah.
And so it is that it is that part of it. We could probably spend some good time talking about people who take bribes against the innocent. Unfortunately, that's something that is probably as old as time. Again, a misuse of money in both of those cases in verse 6. And I find this word, the last word of the psalm, to be interesting, or this section of it, overthrown. Whoever does these things shall never be overthrown. And again, we can think of a kingdom and it gets overthrown and toppled, as Israel did as a kingdom with the Babylonian exile. We can think of people who lose everything by their own mistakes, being their own worst enemy, and they are a sense of overthrown in their way of life, in their households. Others who are shamed and lose notoriety and those kind of things. But I just found that to be an interesting way of describing something overthrown.
Yeah, for an individual to be overthrown.
In likening it a little bit to what Moses said, you will thrive. If you as a kingdom will do these things, you'll be a wise and discerning people, and you will not be overthrown. You'll be looked to and admired and all those kind of things. So there's something about building something up and not losing what you have, but building up notoriety and not just power.
Yeah, like in the previous reading, it was talking about how the people will see you as wise and discerning people.
Right. All right, moving on to James. Let's see if I get it all. Yeah, I can get it all on one screen just like that. Great. Laura Flaherty, would you read this one for us, please?
Certainly. James 1:17-27. Every generous act of giving with every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. In fulfillment of his own purpose, he gave us birth by the word of truth, so that we would become a kind of first fruits of his creatures. You must understand this, my beloved. Let everyone be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger, for your anger does not produce God's righteousness. Therefore, rid yourselves of all sordidness and rank growth of wickedness, and welcome with meekness the implanted word that has the power to save your souls. But be doers of the word, and not merely hearers who deceive themselves. For if any are hearers of the word and not doers, they are like those who look at themselves in a mirror. For they look at themselves and on going away immediately forget what they were like. But those who look into perfect law, the law of liberty, and persevere, being not hearers who forget, but doers who act, they will be blessed in their doing. If any think they are religious and do not bridle their tongues but deceive their hearts, their religion is worthless. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to care for orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained by the world. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Mm.
So here is essentially James's definition of true religion, and he actually spells it out. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God is this, and it's really very succinct: caring for widows and orphans in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained by the world. I think, again, going back to Jesus, part of what the stain that Satan was trying to heap on him there in the wilderness, the three temptations, and Jesus was able to just say, nope, I'm not gonna go those worldly ways for power, for gain, for food, for stomach, all those other kind of things, and I'm not listening to that. Is one of the ways someone was unstained by the world. So that's, it doesn't, when you read the whole passage, it's not just widows and orphans, but there's a lot of it. Being doers, not just hearers. That's important. So I'll open it to y'all for your thoughts and comments.
Well, the beginning of the second paragraph sounds like really good advice for a lot of people, especially parents. Being quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger. We all need that.
Right.
That applies to teachers too.
Yes.
It really
That's why it
applies
struck
to every
me, being a former
relationship.
teacher. Yeah.
It applies to every relationship, I think.
It appears that true religion is summed up in that last sentence, if you will. And I believe that it's got a two-part, as you said, Rob, earlier. It's got a commission and an omission part. The commission is to care, and specifically for orphans and widows and in their distress. And the omission is to keep oneself unstained. So I think that while James might be criticized by the Pauline that he was working on works as a saving message, James here is at least saying part of your works should be works of keeping yourself unstained. And that means that you have to work at omitting certain activities of the world in your life if you want to, quote, be pure and undefiled before God.
Exactly. And I think that's part of the rub between the Pharisees and Jesus in the next passage is the Pharisees see one way of being stained, and Jesus describes another way of being stained. And what does it mean to be unstained by the world then is not clear in this passage. It's not sort of laid out, X, Y, and Z. The 10 Commandments, following those is what maybe one way of being unstained. The summary of the law, as we have talked about, is one way of being unstained.
It makes me think of, isn't that saying that we're supposed to be in the world, but not of the world?
Right.
James does talk about welcome with meekness, the implanted word that has the power to save your souls. Jesus is the word of the, in the Gospels.
Yes. And again, sort of from the inside out instead of from the outside in.
Mm-hmm.
I think of this first line, which is easy maybe just to overlook because everything else is so weighty too, but every generous act of giving is from above. That's the manna from heaven. That's Jesus, those things that have come from heaven. But it's also our generous acts of giving, the inspiration to do that. And again, without looking for a reward, sort of going back to what the psalm was saying. So yes, we are inspired to generosity, and it is in the end our act. That's the end. But in the course of being inspired to do it, being taught to do it, has something to do with the inspiration from above. That we know we give glory. That's why even our plaques at the new Memorial Garden start with "to the glory of God," and in memory of or in thanksgiving of, is sort of to remember that this is first and foremost, any act is about God.
It reminds me of a trampoline, Rob. The trampoline works because a weighted object comes from above and is received by the trampoline. And the trampoline's response to that receipt is to give it back up. And it's a tying in, if you will, James, teaching us that your generosity, your giving isn't just from your heart. It's as a result of your heart being full of grace that you have received from the Father of lights.
Yes. Yes.
I think when you bring up the gifts of the Spirit, and in particular, when I think about our children and our grandchildren, the word in this passage that means the most to me is persevere. And I think it's well chosen for this message.
Mm-hmm.
Perseverance is a necessary part of life as a person who believes in Trinity.
Yes. Yes. Maisie?
Just that reference there in the first paragraph, that we would become a kind of first fruits of his creation. Doesn't that reference to first fruits be what we sacrifice to God, our first fruits?
Yeah, so that's a very Jewish term.
Mm-hmm.
James being Jewish, of course, in the sense of bringing the first of the harvest, the first of the hunt, those kind of things.
Yeah, we don't give him what's left over.
Right.
We have abundance. We'll give, if we have abundance, give him the first fruits. And that's
Mm-hmm.
when trust comes in,
Mm-hmm.
that we'll have enough to.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
And the reference here, interestingly, and this is, I think, very parallel and in sync with Paul's teaching, is, you know, he gave us birth by the word of his truth. This isn't talking about our biological birth or chronological births into certain families, but birth by the word of truth. And so that we then, what he is saying is we as this, as the way, the new Christians, the people following Jesus, are the first fruits. They're the first ones who are getting the blessing of all of this and are able to share that with others. And but giving it to others, to use the trampoline metaphor, not just receiving it and having the springs break and nothing goes back, but that it is returned in those ways.
Cast your bread upon the waters, it will return to you.
I think of all the hours I've spent in capital campaign and other committee meetings, debating giving categories, naming opportunities, all of that stuff.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Seems to be so important in all of those, and I'm not so darn sure it is.
So part of being the first fruits, if we take this passage, is what Laura was saying earlier, being quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger. You know, it's not saying don't be angry, but if our first reaction is anger and we blow up and we stop listening and we get sort of sucked into that vortex of anger, sometimes we miss other parts of the picture that are important to hear. That's one of the things, actually, when there's been a death in the family or some other kind of grief, I counsel folks just to be patient with yourselves and patient with each other, because it's, you know, tensions run high, nerves are already their thinnest, and you end up saying stuff that you wish you hadn't said, or losing a little bit of control, because your control really isn't as much there as you think it is. And I would add to that, part of the quick to listen might even be in two parts: quick to listen to the Holy Spirit, quick to listen to the divine, but then also quick to listen to one another. And I think that part one leads to the other, actually.
All of which our society is so lacking today.
Yes. Yes.
Yep.
It's in some ways, and again, I don't want to go too far down that road, but I do think it's important. It's where I feel social media brings out the worst in people sometimes in those ways, because it just gives you the platform to speak. And there really isn't a dialogue, and the walls of respect begin to disintegrate. I want to, the other word I want to focus on here is the word deceive, which pops up a couple times in here. Self-deception, Lord be, is easy to come by. Again, part of what we might call original sin, but this is deceiving themselves. You know, you have philosophers who say they don't know what they don't know, and we think we're fine and we're not, and that could be our medical health, that could be our spiritual health. It could be our failure to see that the brokenness that we bring to the situation. And that's sort of what the self-righteous often have. And again, thinking of the parable of the prodigal son, it's some of what the older son has in his self-deception. He doesn't quite get what all has been going on in the Father's house. He doesn't quite get repentance and forgiveness. And he thinks of himself more highly than he ought to think. And so that's part of the self-deception. The other thing that we could talk about for a while, if we had a couple days, is this part about let's find the right color for this one. All right, why not that one? Maybe that one, that's better. The perfect law, the law of liberty. Again, Paul talks a little bit about the law of liberty rather than the Mosaic law, rather than the 10 Commandments. You know, for freedom, Christ has set us free kind of language. And we think of, again, the Pharisees are talking about the law, the Mosaic law, whereas Jesus talks about a different law in some ways. In other ways, he's saying, you know, not one jot or tittle of the law goes away, but he's also talking about the grace and faith that are even above the law.
The truth will set you free.
Mm-hmm. And I love this passage, you know, be hearers who, not hearers who forget, but doers who act. You know, there's this great sort of family stories. You're sitting there in church and everybody's behaving and praising God and singing whatever else. You get in the car and you start driving down the road, and then you start calling somebody names and cussing at them and shooting a bird because they cut you off or whatever else. You sort of immediately forget what you just heard about being nice or being slow to anger or whatever else, and that kind of thing. I mean, that's subtle and simple, but then other things can happen in that next hour right after being in church or some other time when, wait a minute, we just forgot what we were saying about love your neighbor. We just forgot about persevering. We just forgot about being quick to listen. Look at me. Yeah, I am deceiving myself. I got to be better at this, that kind of thing.
I think that happens to me about 100 times a day, but.
Yes. Yes.
I'd like to note that the word bridle in this reading is focused on the tongue. However, most people would understand in Jesus's day that the bridle wasn't being used to control the tongue of the person, but the bridle was used to control the horse or the oxen. and it was to not only control it in a forward motion, but in a side to side motion. And a bridle of our tongue can help us either stop going somewhere or start going in another direction.
Yeah, this is not the first and only time that James will use this. Well, we've left Ephesians in the lectionary cycle, and now we're in James for a few weeks. And he will say more about the tongue, and he uses a rudder image. He uses a bridle image, but he is clear in his thought that it's the tongue that is one of the steering mechanisms of the human body.
You think they could be referring to the bridle as like the bridle put on the bride to control her?
Easy, easy.
You're gonna get in trouble there.
That's
right.
Richard.
I see.
Not
No
the
one's gonna
first
fault.
time.
No one's gonna fault you, Mary, if that we see that elbow going in there like that.
Put a bridle on his tongue.
Yeah.
Impossible.
All right, let's move on to Mark. And as you can see from the heading of this, it is not one succinct passage, but a portion followed by another little portion, followed by another little portion. And the lectionary folks, and if you read it, what's germane to this lesson, what Jesus is trying to say, nothing is really left out that's bad. But you do wonder, wasn't that many verses? Why couldn't they have made other verses pretty long? Why not just let the whole passage be long? But the geographically, Jesus is still up in the Galilee area. And so that's why we begin some Pharisees and scribes who had come from Jerusalem. They were sent to dispatch to see what's happening. And one of the first things they notice is his disciples were eating with defiled hands, that is, without washing them. And this is where we get into some of the kosher laws, which come into question any number of times in the New Testament. What's interesting about this parenthetical remark is if Mark were writing to Jews and Jews alone, he would not have to say this.
Right.
They would already know it. So this, what is in parentheses, again, it probably wasn't in parentheses in the original, but it makes sense for us in our linguistic understanding of things, that Mark is basically having to teach Gentiles these Jewish customs. Jews do not eat unless they thoroughly wash their hands, thus observing the tradition of the elders. Again, a commentary. They do not eat anything from the market unless they wash it. And there are also many other traditions that they observe, the washing of cups, pots, and bronze kettles. So essentially what he is saying here is that kind of hygiene is a tradition of the elders, but it's not necessarily from the Mosaic law in the same way some of these other things are. We might call it of secondary or of third importance. For example, someone might say, you can't have church, you don't have a stole on. You can't have church, you haven't lit the candles. You can't have church, we're not in the church, we're not in a building, we're just outside, and that's not church. I mean, all those other kind of things might be, loosely said, the same type of criticisms or categories that would come of this just doesn't seem right, what these traditions are for us. So the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, hey, what's up? Why do your disciples not live according to the tradition of the elders? So they're looking at, they're splitting hairs rather than looking at the big picture. They are getting down to the nitty of gritty and just trying to find something that they could confuse him about. And then Jesus very quickly admonishes them and uses one of the prophets to do so. Isaiah prophesied rightly about you hypocrites, as it is written, the people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. See how close this is to what James was saying about lips and not hearts? In vain they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines. You abandon the commandment of God and hold on to human tradition. Certainly, when we look back in the history of the church, this is some of what the Reformation was about, from Luther to Calvin and other people. That human traditions that had developed within what we call the Roman Catholic tradition seemed to be far away from the commandments of God, loving God, heart, soul, mind, and strength, loving your neighbor as yourself, even the 10 Commandments. And some people might say that even about the Episcopal Church even now, or about the Presbyterian Church, or about the Lutheran Church. And so we're always having to be mindful of that. And so then he teaches them, the crowd is overhearing, and then he calls the crowd again and says, listen to me, all of you, and please, please, please understand. There is nothing outside of a person that by going in can defile. He's not talking about medical things at this point. Those traditions, I would think, did evolve from medical things. We all know it's good to have, clean your food off, not to have dirt or whatever else on the apple when you eat it, or the grapes or whatever else it is. He's talking about spiritual defilement here, because there was a connection between those two. But the things that come out are what defile. It is from within, from the human heart. And here's this part about the heart again, that evil intentions come. And this is what I was saying earlier about what we might categorize as original sin, because they just come out of us. Sometimes they're not even learned behaviors. Fornication, theft, murder, adultery, avarice, wickedness, deceit, licentiousness, envy, slander, pride, folly. These evil things come from within, and they are what defile a person. So I'll say a couple things about this and then ask for your comments as well. Jesus would have had the perfect opportunity here to say something about the 10 Commandments, in particular by saying, like it reads in the 10 Commandments, but he doesn't. Now he makes reference to some of them. Theft is one, murder is one, adultery is one. Some of these others are fairly close, but he doesn't. Again, the audience here is a Greek or Gentile audience. And part of what Mark is doing and what Jesus is doing in speaking to people is talking about things in general morality that Socrates would understand and that Jesus would understand, and Paul and Moses and everything. These are all described one way or another in the Mosaic Law. But these are the things that are what tear down civilizations rather than build them up. So if we look back to Moses and Deuteronomy, the things he was saying, people will think you're wise and it'll build up your nation. These are the things that break down a person, and that break down a community, that break down a family, that break down a nation, that break down the world. And so these are the defiling things, and it's what comes out. And it's coming out of the mouth often, or through the mind to different actions. So it's another talk about morality. So let me open it up to y'all to see what you all think. Speechless.
I kind of feel that this
There was a
makes me realize that we're in a period of transition in our society, that the idea of tradition of washing fruits, which has been referred to in the passage and also by you, is more ceremonial than it is taking care of viral mutation, for example. And so we've now brought in antiseptic hand cleansing, and we would certainly support that. So I think it's a wonderful passage, and I think it can be read again and again as a person who is following true religion.
Jesus mentions hearts in quoting Isaiah, and Jesus is always speaking to individuals who are having trouble understanding Jesus or accepting Jesus, and goes straight to the heart of the person who is struggling or refusing to accept Jesus. In this particular situation, Jesus is using Isaiah, which the Pharisees clearly, buy into, and turning it back on the Pharisees by letting the Pharisees know that Isaiah recognized it's those people whose hearts are far from me don't have, if you will, the true religion.
Right. For where your heart is, there your treasure will be also. Yeah.
My mother used to admonish us as kids when we would say, so-and-so thinks this or so-and-so thinks that. And she would say, you don't know what anybody else thinks. You only know what they say and do. And that is how we know people, by what they say and by what they do.
Right.
Did this happen when the Pharisees questioned the disciples' departure from the Jewish law? Did this happen after, wasn't it Peter and Paul who split a little over their adherence to Jewish law, and whether the new Christians had to abide by the circumcision and the Jewish things? Did this happen after that, when that whole legalistic part of the Jewish law was kind of questioned?
Yes, it did happen after it, and it sort of comes out of the same type of teaching when Jews were trying to reconcile all of these laws that they have with all of the actions of Christ. And what does it mean? Do you have to become Jewish to be a Christian?
Mm-hmm.
And for many Jews, the answer stayed, yes, you do. And for Paul and others, it said, no, you don't. In the end, in Jerusalem, they said, as long as you're not abstaining from fornication and not eating meat that's been sacrificed to an idol, then you're doing okay. So they reduced it to a certain amount as things that really were defiling or outward and visible signs of some form of idolatry or godlessness. So from this list, the fornication part was still in that concept, but the meat sacrificed to idols, I don't know if you would categorize that as something else on that list, deceit, or what?
I think it's pretty amazing that they've singled out fornication above murder and all kinds of.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I'm not sure any one of these things is meant to be number one, number two, number three, as in a rank. But
No.
in mentioning it first, sometimes I worry that we read only the top of this list and forget the bottom of this list.
No, I thought you were saying that they decided that the two things that they held on to for.
Oh, yes, yeah, fornication.
And,
right, because fornication is, in an expanded kind of way, having multiple lovers.
Yeah.
And part of what loving God means is you will have no other gods but me. You'll have no other lovers. And so fornication is being a sign of that kind of thing.
Yeah. Okay. And spiritual fornication, where you spread your allegiance to more than one God.
That's right. Or in some Gentile circles and Greek circles, to have sexual relationships with a priestess of a certain goddess or whatever else was part of the regular tradition. And that was the connection that we would make with the God, and that was also being outlawed.
Yeah. Interesting.
I can think of people in our scriptures. Again, David with pride and adultery, or Cain with murder, Judas with folly or envy or deceit, Herod. I mean, all these people, this is part of what was going on, and was part of their downfall. And for us as human beings, I'm not going to have sort of take score here, but I would guess there are 2 or 3 at least on this list that we are all guilty of in one way or another. And that's part of the sinfulness in ourselves that we have to deal with, which takes me back to the opening hymn. The opening thing was nourishing us in all goodness, is that we are trying to do that, and we're not. If we watch ourselves closely, we're guarding ourselves against all these things that are here. And when we are slipping into them, deceit, envy, slander, pride, folly, those are the way we need to work on turning our own lives around, rather than being pharisaical and just pointing fingers at others.
I would like to just say that how God uses these things in our lives to bring us to our knees. We sort of head out doing what we want to do in our humanness and our sinfulness, and when it doesn't work and it destroys our lives, as we know. I mean, like you were saying, God uses those kinds of things to bring us down from our insistence on doing things our way, and to turn to Him. I think.
Yeah. So I'm not sure if you have a truer sense of religion or not, or what true religion is or not, after reading all these things. I hope it becomes a little more clear for you but it's also a very broad definition of how we are to lead our religious life, how we're to lead our spiritual life, and be those kind of first fruits, and monitor ourselves for things that are going on. Rich, did I see your hand?
You commented about Paul reaching out to the Gentiles and saying that you did not have to be a Jew to be a Christian. I think he probably was a realist and realized the feeling that he could probably proselyte a whole lot more people, not requiring circumcision as being a prerequisite.
That's right, without a doubt.
Rob,